Well, I've heard a description of the problem, and as we know, it's a common problem. It's a complex problem. It's a problem that hits the poor and the deprived, and we're a long way from organising our business to make it a thing of the past. I don't think it's a problem of different parts of the world. I think it's a problem that differentially hits different parts of the society. And it's quite clear that for all societies, those who have least opportunity are most likely to be poorly nourished, whereas those who have most opportunity are least likely to be poorly nourished. Now, it's true that the relative proportion of those with and without opportunity varies from one country to another, and there's far more people without opportunity in the developing world, but wherever you go in the world, there is similar problems of a similar kind for some parts of society. There are a number of ways of looking at it, but the simplest way of asking the question about how many people are malnourished, the marker that we use for being malnourished or poorly nourished in children is whether or not children have grown normally. That is, whether they've gained height and weight at a rate that is accepted. And in adults, whether or not the individual has a normal weight for their height. And generally speaking, in order to maintain the body, you have to take in food. If you don't take in sufficient food, sufficient energy and nutrients, then the body has to use its own substance to maintain itself, and therefore you lose weight. In childhood, not only do you lose weight, but you fail to grow. Normally, childhood is about growing, moving forward. A child who is malnourished, if he stands still, then the other children walk away from him, and with time he becomes further and further behind. And so there are a complex of factors. One is not moving forward, the other is slipping back. So in childhood, not moving forward is associated with being short, stunted, and lack of development. Slipping back is associated with being wasted and becoming progressively more sick. Well-fed is, you offer it as a relative term. There are 8 billion people in the world, 6 to 8 billion people in the world. Most of them function. The question is whether they function as well as they could, and whether they're sufficiently nourished to enable them to function as well as they could. Now, a significant proportion of people function less well than they might because they don't have adequate access to food of good quality on a regular basis. Now, whether that expresses itself as poor function in a mild way, or whether it expresses itself as ill health and sickness, is a matter of degree. Now, we know that for children, there are a significant number of children, predominantly in the developing world, who are not only not growing well, but also sick as a consequence of not having sufficient food, sick enough to mean that they're at grave risk of dying. And so there are something like 5 to 6 million children who die of malnutrition a year around the world. Most of those are in the developing world. Proportionately, in sub-Saharan Africa, a greater proportion of the children in that area are likely to die of malnutrition, whereas the most children are in Southeast Asia because there are most children in Southeast Asia. So it is predominantly a problem of the developing world, although it can be seen anywhere in the world. There has always been a food crisis for some people in the population. There may be food in the world, but not everybody can access it, either because they don't have enough resource, enough money, they aren't able to get sufficient food of good quality, or whatever reason. The population of the world is set to grow substantially between now and 2030, 2050, which means that the requirements for food for that increase in population are going to be substantially greater. We are already feeling the pinch of limited availability of food, And the last 6 months has seen in sub-Saharan Africa a significant increase in food prices, a limited availability of food, and an increase in the numbers of children who are presenting and dying with malnutrition. So there is a problem about ensuring that those who are most in need of food get access to the food that is available at a price they can afford. There is the additional problem that as the population increases, that the challenge is going to get even greater. The good news is that the populations of the developing world over the last 20 years have done remarkably well. And the food produced in South America by Brazil, in Southeast Asia by India, and in the Far East by China has grown substantially over the last period of time and has kept pace with the increasing population, and more people are now able to get sufficient food than ever before. But you have to run very fast just to stand still. And we are reaching a stage where it is less clear how well we will be able to match the increasing needs for food with increasing productivity. It is a big challenge. In the past, the world has been faced by similar challenges, and that by using its resources sensibly and appropriately, it has managed to cope to a certain extent. But it does require careful thought and planning and effort to ensure that those who need food most get it. At the moment, there are a lot of people who don't get sufficient food. There will be more in the future, so the problem is going to get more challenging rather than easier for the next period. We set up an institute of human nutrition in Southampton to try to deal with nutrition in the round. Nutrition is a facet of everybody's life. Everybody is an expert in a sense because everybody does it at least once a day, they hope, some 3 or 4 times a day. But it's nobody's responsibility. It covers areas from the basic sciences through clinical studies to population levels. There are issues about educating, particularly my interest is educating the health profession, doctors and nurses, to do things better. There is the research that's required to drive issues forward. There's a question of delivering services. We have in Southampton General Hospital a nutrition team which ensures that all the patients in the hospital, however sophisticated or simple their nutritional requirements, they are met in an appropriate way. So the objective of setting up an institute was to have an umbrella under which all of these interrelated activities could take place, and each area could usefully inform the other. So that the reason we do research is to deliver a better service. If we're going to deliver a better service, we have to teach the health profession about the findings of the research so they can use it more effectively. And so the work that takes place in terms of basic sciences, in terms of cellular work, genetic work, informs what happens in terms of looking after patients. Looking after patients in hospital is a statement of those who've come from the community. One of the most important issues in nutrition is to prevent problems rather than waiting to treat them once they've arisen. And in order to prevent those problems, you obviously have to deal with a wider community, not simply those who come into hospital. But there is a big problem in hospitals. As much as 40 or 50% of patients who come into hospital have a nutrition problem that is sufficiently severe that it will interfere with other aspects of their treatment and care. And so if you don't pay attention to the nutritional consideration, they will do less well. And we know that if you give patients adequate nutritional support while they're in hospital, you can cut complications by as much as maybe 70%. You can stop people dying by as much as 30 to 40%. So it's not a trivial issue. It's an important issue in hospital. It's an important issue in the community. Nutrition remedy, there's a nutrition component. As a matter of course, people have to eat the right food. one of the important contributions that work in Southampton has made, particularly under the leadership of my colleague David Barker, is to demonstrate that the size of newborn babies is very closely related to their risk of getting diseases, chronic diseases later in life, heart disease, cancer, diabetes and obesity. And so this epidemic of chronic non-communicable diseases that we have increasingly now is not simply what happens now, it is a reflection of what happened earlier in life. Clearly the size of the baby when it's born is determined by how well it grows in the uterus before it's born, and that's importantly related to the mother's ability to provide it with nutrients. Now, the mother's ability to provide it with nutrients is much related to what she brings to her pregnancy. So the better nourished a woman when she starts a pregnancy, the better able she is to provide nutrients to her baby, the better grown that baby will be, and the better developed that baby will be, so its resistance to illness and the challenges of life later on will be greater. And so there is this long shadow of what the early nutritional experience of a mother before and during pregnancy is, in terms of what the infant and child is able to do and their risk of catching disease later. So it's a continuity, it's a life cycle that goes between one generation and the next. And so investing in nutrition early in life is not only an investment for life, but it's an investment between generations. If you sit back and say, well, what are the basics of life? Fresh air, clean water, wholesome food, and shelter. And whoever you are, wherever you are, that's the core of what living is about, being alive is about. As we develop, we devote less time to worrying about those because we're better organized, and more time to doing other things that generate pleasure. But the fact that we spend more time doing those other things doesn't mean to say that the fundamentals aren't important. And if we don't take care of the fundamentals, then sooner or later we'll pay a cost. So the question is, how do we best enable people to understand and live a life that's appropriate in terms of those fundamentals without it being burdensome, so that they can enjoy the other finer points of life? I think we've moved with development to a position where we've lost sight of some of those fundamentals. And because we've lost sight of those fundamentals, we've not taken sufficient care to ensure that they are in place appropriately so that we can enjoy them without having to think about them. We now have to go back and think about them, put them in place appropriately so we can get on with living without being too concerned about them. And we're at a stage where in a sense we've been too fortunate, so that we've ignored what are the fundamentals, and we have to go back and think about how we manage them better than we have in the recent past. No, I don't think one goes back. I think life is about moving forward, but when you move forward, then you have to take the fundamentals with you in an appropriate and sensible way. And I think that we do need to reflect carefully about what is important in life, what is important at a fundamental level and how we can best achieve that, and then what that enables us to do in terms of the wide range of opportunities, increasing range of opportunities that life now offers. There is a value to having those fundamentals in place, which we've rather lost sight of. Clearly, people are getting heavier year on year, and that is undesirable. We now have the situation where young children are clinically obese, and young children are having chronic diseases which 15, 20 years ago we only saw in adults and now appearing in young children, and that is obviously an undesirable situation. It isn't due to a single cause. There are many facets to the cause, but certainly one key facet is the level of activity that children engage in as a normal part of life. The other key facet is the quality of the food that they eat, the quality of the food that they consume, against that background of not engaging in activity. We know from the National Diet and Nutrition surveys that government carries out for the population to get a sense of the diet of the population and how that affects their health, that young adults today have a very poor quality diet, a worryingly poor quality diet. We know that that is so. We have been very slow to really pick that up in terms of what we need to do about it. And in some senses, we're a soft society and we're very soft on this problem. It is a problem that's staring us in the face, and we're still very gentle in our approach to it. I think that probably we're going to have to be much more serious with ourselves about the nature of the problems, the magnitude of the problems, but more importantly, how we go about addressing them as a community at large. There has been an important shift in society. I mean, I think that food and nutrition is now more on the agenda than it has ever been. I think that probably one of the difficulties and challenges is joining up those enthusiasms so that they're all working in the same direction. It isn't that nobody's concerned. Increasingly, all sorts of groups are concerned, and we have a lot of enthusiasm for doing things. One of the difficulties is that often people do things and we don't know whether they work. We don't have a very good idea of what the experiences are that really make a difference and what the enthusiasms are that can't be sustained and don't make a difference. And part of that is evaluating the interventions that are put in place. And one of the challenges to nutritional science, to assist communities, to assist government, is to introduce better mechanisms of evaluating what is done, either singularly or as more complex interventions, to see what works and what doesn't work. And if things don't work, to understand why they don't work, so that we're better able to assist in making them, addressing those reasons why they don't work. And that's an important research agenda. Now, unfortunately, that research agenda at this point in time doesn't compete with discovering new genes. It doesn't compete with a new pharmacological therapy. And so the resource that we commit to that is modest compared to the magnitude of the problem. And so there's a need for a reordering of priorities and a reordering of the resource in order to address those fundamental issues at a societal level, where everybody becomes part of solving the problem because it's everybody's problem to solve. I'm very cautious about using language that is emotive and carries emotive meaning. There is no doubt that there are some foods that, if they are consumed in too large amount, too frequently, are bad for you. You know, there are, and today part of the privilege of childhood is that there is ready access to foods which used to be an occasional treat. They're foods that are high in sugar, salt, and certain fats. There are foods that have water taken out of them so that for every mouthful you get a lot more energy than you ought to. There are foods that don't have very much in the way of nutrients. So you consume energy and salt without consuming nutrients. The body has nothing to do with that, but lay it down as fat or as adipose tissue, so you get fat. And so those foods, of course, there's nothing wrong in having a treat and eating them, but if they are the staple of your diet, then you will end up in problems. And we haven't got that balance right. We haven't got the sense of a special treat right as opposed to a standard usual diet. It is said that the population was better fed during the war than at any other time because food was not only rationed, but the quality, the content and quality was regulated. We know that in the post-war period, children were given supplements of food at school, they were given milk to drink, and it had an important effect upon their growth. However, we have to look at it the other way around as well. We know from the experience in Holland that during the Dutch hunger winter, when food rations were really quite severely restricted, that the children that were being carried by their pregnant mothers at the time of that famine have grown up to have greater risk of ill health than other populations. And the question that we don't know the answer to is where along this spectrum of deprivation in terms of quality and quantity the real risk lies. I think the likelihood is that on balance, that the population, the baby boomer population, is much better off than those born in the 30s during the Depression. But it may be that there are particular patterns of disease or ill health that we will see coming through. It's very, very difficult to know this because we have that earlier experience matched against increasing rates of obesity. We know that increasing rates of obesity are associated with a lot of cancers, cancer of the breast, cancer of the colon, cancer of the prostate. And so it may be that we get a complex change in the pattern of disease, and the question is how that plays out for the total population. The current perception that we have is that the nutritional exposure that you have during early life, when you are being formed and your capability is being formed, if you stay with that type of diet throughout life, you are better off than if you're exposed to a poor quality diet earlier on and then have access to everything. And so you're more at risk at challenging the setup for a poor quality diet than you would be if you had less food. So undoubtedly the statement is at each stage you need to have a balanced diet which is appropriate. If in your early life you didn't grow well and therefore your capability of doing things is limited, then you have to be even more careful about the quality of the exposure, the diet that you have during adult life, because you are more vulnerable and it is easier for you to take the wrong thing than somebody who had a better earlier experience.